What I really hope that this panel does today is not only brings you insights into the challenges that these individuals are facing within their Indian-based companies and or from a consulting perspective, but also provides some insight into how they're best seeing a method or a methodology to help prepare young talent not only for the challenges they face today, but also the challenges that they face for tomorrow and in the future. So what I'd love to do is just start with the first question. Purdue, this will go to you, but given the rapid pace of change in the environment, what do you see as the 3 most critical characteristics leaders may need to have to be successful today?
Thank you. Thank you for the question and for inviting me here. So I'll answer that in 2 parts, right? So if I just try to answer it straight off the bat, some of the characteristics that I believe will really be important. The first is resilience, which is given the pace of change, the fact that people have to handle multiple upsets even in a single day at senior levels. So resilience is really important, the ability to bounce back from setbacks. The second is what we call the telescope and microscope, which really means can you have the ability as a leader to look far into the future and kind of plan ahead and be somewhat visionary, and at the same time, be as involved in the detail. So we normally always say that, oh, so-and-so is a big picture guy, and this guy is more of an operational guy. And nowadays, you need to be both. And you can imagine what happens if you put a telescope in one eye and a microscope in one, you get a massive headache. So it's actually quite a hard thing to do. The third is on decisiveness. And I think the whole way that leaders make decisions is kind of somewhat changing. So let me kind of explain why. So in the past, we could make decisions in one of 2 ways. Number one, pattern recognition. So I've made the same decision many times and I can make it again. And the second is just my gut. I think that this makes sense. Now, the way things are changing, at least in some spaces, that's very hard to do. You can't rely on your gut anymore because it's too complex. And neither can you rely on pattern recognition because those patterns aren't there. So then what do? And then the leaders who can actually make the right types of decisions are those that have the skill to be able to quickly talk to many people, quickly take in a lot of inputs, integrate them, and then make their own decision. And that's actually quite a different skill than people are used to. And I would just add one more, I know you asked for 3, which is managing your own energy. So rather than managing time, am I as a leader being able to manage my own energy? The last thing I would say is that all this is contextual. So depending on the context of the organization, many of these things might vary, right? So whether I'm in a phase of operational improvement or M&A has a big impact on what skills will be needed at that point.
Other things that the panelists would like to add? Dr. Vishal?
So I think the keynote kind of addressed the point that even we've been talking about. We are talking a lot about humility in our organization because these are the people who are then open to collaborate, to work with others, with others. They are able to put themselves behind the organization goal and so on. I'm reminded of this quote which is attributed to Churchill. So, when he was told about someone that, look, he's a humble leader, so Churchill said he's got much to be humble about. But in today's world, I think humility is something that we are really looking for. Apart from, and hence linked to that is your ability to then talk about your failures and struggles, etc. And then ability to hence learn from them. I think these are some connected traits that we talk about.
Just to build on Faridun's idea of the telescope and microscope, and both are glasses as such, lenses. So I think what is important is the quality of the lens, and which people look for is clarity and candor, and we actually tend to derail for the lack of both. Right? I just add these 2.
Roland, RJ?
Is this on? Yeah. So I think it sounds like restating the same thing that everybody's saying, but I would say learning agility becomes very important. And to oversimplify that, I think someone earlier was talking about the or unlearn. It's the ability to learn things, to unlearn them, and then relearn them, which I think is critically important. And I think strategic agility, which you alluded to, is very important. I think what we find is a lot of our leaders are very good at problem solving, but not always the greatest at identifying the right problem to solve. And so I think that gets back to what you were talking about.
I think we all are thinking the same thing, using different words and language for it. But I'd agree what Dr. Bob Hogan had referred to as thinking on the fly, you know, having the agility to take decisions on the go. And of course, the strength of the collective in an organization, I think, becomes critical for today's leaders. So that's...
Well, thank you. Given the discussion about resilience, decision-making, learning agility, learning strategically, I would add learning to fail quickly. Let's roll into a second question. Emmy, I'll start with you. Can each of you take 3 minutes and describe what your organization is doing to develop people today and for tomorrow?
Yeah. When we look at my organization, we are about 700,000 people, and we are in about 100 countries, and different geographies and different lines of business, 7 lines of large businesses. And also there are the emerging sectors. So developing leadership there becomes paramount. So we're looking at the whole talent architecture very differently. And I mean, the words of Abraham Lincoln comes out very clearly. He says, you cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today. So the strategic vision is what drives. And at the Tatas, we're trying to define it as how do we kind of prepare people who have the necessary skills and the capabilities, as well as the attitude to be effective. And until unless we do it today, we can't really get there. But of course, the Tatas have been doing it since '56 through the TASK program, but frequently we do refresh the way we work around that. And we've also realized that it's important to work with large groups of people so that they're fleet-footed. So even the pedagogy which we do is undergoing a change. It's getting to be more, interactive, immersive, as well as focusing on some of the qualities which Faridun and the rest of the panel have mentioned. And we're kind of having boot camps and workshops around that. And factors like the whole emotional piece, like emotional intelligence, are also taking forefront. So, as well as giving them hard skills. I think that's where we are, and it's going to be very exciting. So some of it is work in progress, so in a few weeks we're going to unveil everything. And so I think we're all excited about that as well, that there's a whole lot of hope. And when you look at the opportunity canvas which is there for all the companies, I think there's a lot we can do, and we have to do it maybe even yesterday.
Thank you. Roland, what's new and different, or what are you focused on at your organization at Interglobe?
I'm a little bit worried because we actually put a program in place called Leading Today for Tomorrow. So I don't know if we owe you a royalty or you owe us a royalty. But I'm sure that
Three Fish will write you a check.
No, actually, we were influenced by the Hogan work. But interesting thing, there was a lot of effort, and there has been effort to bring the right people in, and the group has actually used the Hogan a lot. But what we actually then were looking at, we looked at the succession at the most senior level, and it was clear that our promoter had even stated in meetings to several of our CEOs that this isn't the group for the future. But he loves them, and he was very complimentary, but he was saying we need to move forward and we need to start looking at succession. And so we started looking at succession at the C-1 and even down further. And what we ended up doing is putting together a program that had a whole bunch of different elements. It's not a program, it's a process, a journey, if you will. It has psychometric assessments, has 360s, has various modules, has a journey along with peers, so peer coaching. But we also then implemented individual coaching with third-party coaches. And the interesting thing is that we found that even though our group had used the Hogan for the hiring process and that opportunity to look at who was a fit, we hadn't used the Hogan for the development process. And so what we learned is that some of our leaders knew they took the instrument, had a quick debrief, but never had a longer discussion about what this means for them progressing going forward. And so over the course of the last year and a half, 40, maybe 38 of our C-1 level people have been through this process. During that process, we actually sold one of our companies, and so 14 of those leaders went on somewhere else, but we figured we did a good thing. And also, we think we created value in the people that actually purchased that organization. And then, most recently, one of our group companies, Indigo, who has, it's a publicly traded company, listed company, has decided to join part of that journey as well. And so what we believe we've done as a group with the support of our leadership is put together a journey as opposed to an event. And we also have been very clear that it's yes, the responsibility of the company to provide opportunities. Notice I'm saying this guarded, but we say that this is a self-directed journey. And what we've now said is that this is a directed, self-directed journey, meaning there's some things that we as a group believe, we believe there are certain behaviors that we would like to see. And then we also believe that, you should own your development journey as well.
Great. Why don't we stick on the industry side? Dr. Vishal, if you don't mind sharing from a corporate perspective, that would be fantastic.
So one of the things we are trying out is what the term used is called the jagged resume, right? Which is the resume that does not fit. And so we've, on a small scale, but we've tried out hiring people from very, very different backgrounds. For example, we hired an army commando for a sales role for some of the very new companies like Google and Facebook too, and it's working exceedingly well. For a large program manager, we tried hiring someone who's a wedding coordinator and a programmer, right? Who handles large events. We have another program which is called the Global 100, where we hire from some of the top universities in the world, and here we make sure. So ours is a IT services company, and we make sure that they do not have technology background, unlike the rest of the company. And we rotate them, and initially there was a lot of resistance to them, but we found that people have really started appreciating the alternative viewpoints that they're bringing. So these are some of the initiatives on a small scale, but yeah.
Faradun, Rajita, in terms of from a consulting perspective, what are you seeing in terms of the same thing, but from the outside looking into organizations? What are the unique things that they're doing in the industry?
So I guess a couple of things, right? So number one, I think organizations are doing much more, spending much more money, and are much more thoughtful than they would have been a few years ago. So that's the first thing, right? Which is it's much more of a CEO, senior management topic than relegated to junior HR, which may have been the case many years ago. That's number one, right? That being said, if you look around the world at organizations who really do this well, there are a few things that stand out, right? And very few organizations actually do all of them. The first really is making sure that the learning journey is grounded in what the business really needs versus what the individual needs or what one thinks is cool. So what are the 2 or 3 real big shifts that are needed for the organization, and how do they actually create value, and how do you do that? That's number one. Number 2 is, in a sense, talent to value, which is, am I getting the right people who are in the right roles to go through these journeys based on the value they bring? So that's the second thing. The third is scale, which is, and this is really going to become important going forward, because unless you have a critical mass of people who are actually going through a similar journey and speaking the same language, the new ways of working don't really become embedded. And one of the challenges that I see as organizations are going more, journey of one and digital, is that you make sure you don't lose that. Because unless you have 200 people or 300 people or 1,000 people who are learning the same things and talking the same language, you're not going to be able to really imbibe it. If I go online and learn something and you do something else and you do something else, you kind of lose that. And the last thing I've seen is a lot more focus now, rightly so, on mindsets versus just skills, right? So the focus on who leaders are versus on what leaders do and what leaders know. And in a sense, a lot of that type of work was outside the corporate kind of anvil a few years ago. It's coming more in. So those are some of the things that I would say.
I'd also agree with a lot of what Faridun has said. And yes, the intent is very strong now in corporates for leadership development. And I have, at Three Fish, we work a lot with personality. So we've seen that organizations where we have had leadership development engagements, where the accountability of development is not just on the participants of the program, but there is a lot of recognition to it and a lot of accountability built in even within the organization. The response and the outcomes have been far more sustainable, far more pronounced. And I think someone mentioned earlier, there's a lot more pride associated with it now. Yeah.
Well, I think that's great, and how each of you have touched on, not only it starts with the right person, not necessarily the right person with the right skills, for your example, but rather using selection to hire good individuals or to bring them in and then finding the best path for them over time. And then I love the point about, do they have the right mindset? And which rolls into, as we were talking about humility earlier this morning and other topics. The other comment that I think sets up this next question really well is to the point that there's more money being spent and these topics are really focused, the focus now of our CEOs and our senior level management. The question I'd ask is, what challenges or pressure do you see, and then what are some of the things you're doing to alleviate that pressure coming from the business in terms of your talent agenda? So in the past it has been, oh, this is talent development, you know what to do. Now it is, this is a priority, it's oftentimes a board priority. But what are those challenges, and how do you start approaching those? And Dr. Vishal, we'll start with you.
So I think, we've all been speaking for many years about the leader to be more authentic, open, collaborator, all these things. I think it's finally time where these are becoming an actual reality, and you actually need people who, so if a leader is not collaborator, it directly hurts the business, for example, because the deals that we get are very integrative in nature. So things like that. So the challenges really now are, as you mentioned, really a mindset challenge, where people need to shift quickly. Traditional business is dropping very fast. New business actually needs this leader if we have to succeed. So that's one critical thing, which is really that the mindset change needs to actually happen today, now. It's no longer a luxury that needs to happen. The other thing is, clients are expecting us to tell them what is going to happen in their business, right? So lead through insights, etc. And so that's where some of these things that we try working with them on, weak signals or peripheral vision, and really figuring out what next and helping the client sort of figuring out what's going to happen. So more think along with the client, so to speak, right? So that's the other thing that's happening, right? So.
Well, we look at challenges and pressures which are there, but I want to share 2, 3, green shoots of partnerships, right? And given the fact that we do quite a lot of Hogan assessments in a year, I'll single out 2 things. There was one company who wanted an assessment center. Then we said, for good measure, we will also do Hogan. They said, what is Hogan? We explained. And then we looked at the Hogan results for the aggregate. And they were able to kind of tell them that, hey, the likelihood of you meeting your business result, could be diminished when you look at the aggregate scores. And this could be the kind of culture. And would you like to do something about it? And that MD invited me to meet with the board, the NRC, and now we are on a development journey. What would have been just an event is now become an engagement. And over the years, with some of our senior leadership programs, we've been working with the Hogan as an assessment tool, and we maintained a point of view that, listen, this is individual. Fair enough, because we maintain that individuality, confidentiality. But we looked at an aggregate over time and said there are some, trends. We spoke to people in the leadership, and now they said, Emmanuel, can you take this further? And we've actually coaching several people, several leaders, over a period of time, and it's linked to their job description, their 360, and their goals, and the Hogan. And our coaches are both business coaches and are trying to understand the behavior part of it. And that's been a happy journey. And we can see that, yes, things are happening, but it's work in progress, but I believe it's people see the value of some of these things. So it's no more a challenge, but slowly going from that pressure to a partnership.
If I might just add, so I think and everyone will agree, you can look at any kind of survey or any set of questions when CEOs around the world are asked, name your top 3 challenges, leadership and talent will be in the top 3. I mean, you can look at it anyway. At the same time, and I saw this somewhere, there was a survey of Fortune 500 CEOs as to how satisfied are you with your organization's leadership development and talent. The answer is only 9%, or 7 or 9%, which means there's still a gap, right? So the business leaders don't see that they don't see impact to the extent they'd like to, despite doing a lot of stuff. There are probably 3 or 4 reasons that's driving that. So one, I think, is already mentioned, which is the development is not linked to the context. So there's no kind of direct linkage between the two. It's not linked to the context. The second is not linked to business, which is not linked to ongoing transformations, right? Which is the here and the now. And then, of course, there's the element of mindset, which you kind of brought out. And I think another area that at least I've seen is that just the way you described it, which is a set of different interventions that are strung together in a coherent manner. Many organizations make an error of doing all these things, but not stringing it together. So I'll hire you to do the Hogans, and then I'll get somebody to come and do 3 workshops, and then I'll get a professor from IIM to talk about strategy, and then I'll get, Sadhguru to come and talk about spirituality. And you have all the things in the world, but there's almost no impact. Because in a way, the sum of the parts is never as much as the whole together. So,
one quick point on a thing I said, it's related to that. I think the biggest challenge that I face and that many face is demonstrating impact. And so, over the years have increased my fluency in talking about the risk management, the cost of not doing something. And that often catches enough attention. What does it mean if all of a sudden we lose a heroic leader? How will the business be sustained? I think we can make a case for that, but if that's all you do, that's not going to where you should go. And it's what the value could be created by doing something. And to the point that you just made, one of the things that we've been very aggressive about is making sure that we tie action projects to the learning journey, one back in their teams wherever they are, but also we've been selective about identifying some of the key elements of what we say would be organizational transformation that we need to work on, whether it's reviewing a new business opportunity or we're just forming a new action team. We call them tiger teams because people like tigers in India, some people like tigers in India. But we have these tiger teams who form on very short periods of time with very clear objectives that have an executive sponsor, have a team coach, and then have some of these very talented individuals be able to work across function or out of their group and come up with recommendations. And that's a process that we've been starting over the last year. And we've seen some success, and it's actually pretty easy for us to measure some of those and demonstrate value. And then what we say is, and then the people who they work for actually believe they're better leaders as well, and we measure that.
From consulting perspective, I would agree that when we have worked with clients that truly partner with us, where every challenge can then be converted to a dialogue, then it's a brilliant opportunity really for development. But when it is random events that have to be conducted and something has to be bought and done, then of course the result is that much more diluted. And then therefore the impact is diluted. So we have found some very satisfying journeys for even the businesses. When we've partnered with them, we worked with them for what they see as challenge and what are the possible solutions we can offer. And therefore, how do the leaders who are a part of that journey, how do they take these learnings forward? That strategic self-awareness which we've been talking of since morning, how do you take that forward? And then therefore, how do you convert it to a business impact? So it's really about partnering with clients.
So to go off script, as you probably knew I would, in terms of the questions, speaking about impact, and I think this is a good time, how would, and it may be one, two, or all of you responding, how does your organization define impact? So how do you truly show value of your programs? Is it saving one leader? Is it simply a shift in behaviors or being ready or having a talent depth chart? What does success mean in your organizations that you can share with the audience?
I can. It's a good question, and then it has always dogged me. In my current role, I look after leadership development in TMTC, but I was a practitioner, and when people used to come and say we will do some capability building, I used to really question them to death and say, what's the impact? So when we started working about a year and a half ago, we did a very intensive study to understand how are our programs being met, and is there some change or not? And we looked at it and said, yes, there was learning. And wherever people said there was learning, they also said they were able to create some business impact, you know. And where people did not say there was learning, then even the business impact was low. So, and we did it over a statistically significant population, over our leadership, tiered leadership offerings. And we were quite pleased that things are happening. And actually that is also, the show's success is, as what Roland also mentioned, we have been doing a lot of action learning projects. Now, there's been a couple of things on action learning projects. At one level, we used to get live cases from the different Tata companies and write a case about it. And it is work in progress. So the team were actually solving a real case. And we crowdsourced ideas. And because it was relevant and the strategic, all the concepts were getting embedded through this action learning project, the learners understood something. But the client companies who sponsored the case actually got back some valuable suggestions. One of the things was there's a smart watch which got developed for safety. Then a strategic plan of a company was totally looked at, and there were white spaces which were told. A go-to-market for a particular niche product for one of the companies was suggested. Then we have another level of program where we also do run, my colleague who runs that program is also in the audience, Karan, with the University of Michigan. And we have, again, action learning projects with individual stake, and it's monitored, and then we find that substantive value is getting created. And that creates, you know, a very virtuous cycle that people say, yes, we need to send more into these programs. And I think that that's a happy space to be in. But for that, I think we need to paddle very hard. And, you know, and it's not that you can't rest on the laurels of one or two such things. You got to keep paddling very hard to see that it just keeps happening again and again, because there's also, you're trying to work, to meet the expectations which are there.
So, as a philosophy, we've had our CFO saying that he's not really worried about numbers as far as L&D is concerned in impact. So when the CFO says that, you know that L&D is in a good place, right? Because he's saying it. However, over a period of time, we have been trying to get more and more, tying to business results. So, for example, we have a program where non-sales folks move into sales. So there's a specific metric we track in terms of how much extra business they've generated. The hypo program, for example, we actually try and track how many role changes have happened, for example. Some of the other ones, we actually try and see if there is a change in customer satisfaction. The correlation is not always very clear, but we do try and do all that, apart from whatever you said, which is the projects, etc., which you can have some other kinds of impact that is shown.
I just say the following, and I'll answer maybe in two ways, right? So I think one is that, and this topic has been discussed a lot, which is how do I measure it, and I measure 17 metrics and so on and so forth. And my sense is that one has to appreciate that this is kind of an adaptive, subjective thing that you're looking at, and sometimes doing 5 interviews with senior leaders as to what are you seeing is actually much more insightful than tracking 25 metrics, right? And you actually get a lot, you actually can pick up a lot kind of out of that. So that's, I think, the first thing, right? If I talk a little bit internally about within McKinsey, the way that, and I don't look after learning and development internally, but it's a pretty extensive setup where at different transition points we have global programs. So it's not local, it's global. And those are quite carefully curated. But even then we find from time to time that people are saying, look, young managers are finding it difficult to problem solve in a certain way. So how do you actually kind of tweak that, and how do you keep doing that? Or for example, recently, as everyone knows, analytics and digital has become a big thing. So in our last partners conference, with all the partners around the world, there was 1.5 days where everyone was basically taught the basics. So you're kind of at least somewhat aware about it. I think the last thing I'd like to say is, and this is my belief as to why this challenge is so hard, which is, this comes from the work of Zenger, and you must have seen that book, and so on and so forth, which is the bottom, if you think about the bottom 20% percentile of leaders in an organization, they probably destroy value, if you want to put it very bluntly. The top 20 percentile add disproportionate value. So the great leaders probably add 3 to 4 times value. I think one of the theories is that the problem is when you go from the 20th to the 80th, it's not a slope. It's almost a flat line, and then there's a jump. So if I move a leader from the 50th to the 70th percentile, I don't actually see much improvement in the business, although they might have personally grown, but I don't really see that. And therefore it comes back to, do I have, in a sense, almost an unfair share of great talent? Because otherwise you're going to make people improve, but that's not going to be visible enough for it to make a difference for people to appreciate it.
Great, thank you. This morning, Dr. Hogan talked about effectiveness and emergence. And I'm curious, with this panel's perspective, you can say he's right or he's wrong. He's in the back of the room, and you can bring that up with him later. But RJ, we'll start with you to put you on the spot. How do you see effectiveness and emergence playing into talent programs and their design for the future to ensure we are maximizing the diamonds in the rough that may be buried deep in the organization?
Sure. It's interesting because we see that varying from industry to industry, from one company to another. And there is some amount of conscious awareness of whether are we inclined towards emergence or towards effectiveness, and sometimes there's not much awareness around it. So really the talent development programs more often than not begin from the point of us having conversations around emergence and effectiveness, bringing those concepts in, putting a language around it, and then exploring further with the organizations what exactly would they really like to have there. Because the conversation becomes more interesting when we are saying, so if you have a leader who's high emergence, what happens to the effectiveness of it? Or if a leader is high effectiveness, And culturally, there is a need for a high emergent leader. How are we working with that aspect in the organization? So conversations do get very interesting, and that is where, I guess, comes in the ability to custom design development programs for organizations. And so it becomes a process of not just delivering what is required for development program, but it's almost an educational conversation, if you will. So that's really where I see emergence and effectiveness playing out for us in our consulting work.
Others on the panel?
Ryan, I have a different view. I greatly respect what Dr. Hogan said, and it's a great thought. But I think this emergence concept is good for cocktail discussions, you know? And we do it, you know, day after day. We say, well, what a good guy he is, and stuff like that. But, you know, we're all products of an environment. You know, you look at any average B school, even an average B school, there is so much accent on effectiveness and, you know, being there to get ahead, right? And if there's a thing of getting along and working together, though we might kind of script it, but that's not rewarded. So, over time, right from, you know, when you start telling, son, you're first, and when you're a 5-year-old or a girl, you know, or a daughter, you know, you're great, you're the first in singing. I think that's what is getting ingrained. We're learning all that. And suddenly we come, at age 35, you do a Hogan and say, boss, to be a leader, you got to have these things. You've never learned it in your life. But then, privately, in a cocktail discussion, we agree, right? And we say, you know, how he derails, what is the situation? So I think it's a bit of a conundrum. You know, how do we bell the cat? I don't know. But I think this is where it is. Perhaps we might have this conversation again after some time if we don't do something at the formative years.
So, you know, if I interpret this correctly, right? So I mentioned that we have, for example, a program where people from non-sales roles move into sales roles, right? And this is a CEO-sponsored program. And the philosophy is that the traditional salesperson who's like all out there, you know, his personality and exuberant and all that, is becoming less and less effective compared to the solid, strong delivery person who manages to convince the customer much better because of the expertise that carries. And it's that conviction that has kind of made this a CEO-sponsored program that, you know, we want people now to move into. So if I've interpreted this correctly, this is a good example of how people who are in the behind scenes kind of, you know, actually being seen as more effective.
So in that, it's probably coaching them out of their comfort zone is really what we're seeing there. Go ahead.
I think and I wasn't there in the morning, so I don't know exactly the discussion, but I think it's really important to now, given that we have the advantage of being much more data-driven, to kind of make this much more granular than a kind of a broad brush, right? So let me give you an example. We did some work with a very big fast food chain in the US, one of the common ones, and their challenge was that they were falling behind the competitors in terms of, you know, per store, whatever, sales and stuff. And one of the things that we did was people analytics, which was to try and see the people who actually, when you go and you say, listen, I want a burger and I want fries, the person who serves you, to look as to what type of person is best fit for those roles. And you know, they measured many, many different things, including tone of voice and all sorts of different things. And they came up with their 4 archetypes of such people. So one is the very social, friendly person, you know, who'll ask you what's a great day it is, how's your dog, it's a beautiful dog, that type of stuff. The other is a person who kind of is very rule-based and just follows all the rules. The third is a person who's very creative and comes up with all sorts of different things and so on and so forth. And there was a fourth. Now, you would have expected that for a role like that, the exuberant, friendly person would actually be the most effective. In fact, that was not the case. It was the person who followed the rules, in the most kind of, just followed the rules and did it, turned out to be the most effective. So I think that, and that's not always going to be the case, but I think depending on a specific role and what needs to happen there, it might actually vary. And therefore, some of these kind of biases or, you know, either way, that this is better or that's more effective may actually not be true. This is a sales role, but it's not that you need an exuberant person to do that role. And I'm sure there'll be other roles where you'll say the opposite. So,
You know, just a kind of a point on that, and then going back to your conundrum concept. You know, I think this is it a conundrum or is it a paradox? And I kind of look at it as kind of this polarity concept, is that we have to hold them both in the hand at the same time. And I think that's what you were saying, you know, meaning it's about a leader's ability to flex. And I think that's what we're talking about. You know, for years, you know, and even in the group, we talk about leading self first, leading team second, leading organization third, leading society, community fourth. Now, the reason why we start with self, and then somebody said, well, that's pretty self-centered. And we said, not at all. It's becoming aware, but also know that you are becoming self-aware to lead others, not to lead yourself. And I think that gets back to Dr. Hogan's point about the real clarity is your ability to lead a team. And your ability to lead a team, if you're a CEO, that team is the organization and your board. But as people come up and they understand that my ability to flex my behavior, to be real, to be transparent, to be honest, those kind of things, as well as being very credible, being able to close a deal if that's your job, or design a plant if that's your job, that it's a balance between those. But then ultimately, as you get closer to the human factor, it's about these skills of connecting and being understood and listening and understanding that'll actually be the differentiator for you as you go.
Great. Dr. Rowan, since you have the mic, and what I'd like is for each of you, 60-second soundbite of the following. If you could look into a crystal ball and know what the next 5 years of talent development holds in India, what do you see would be the best situation organizations could find themselves in with their talent programs? Start with you.
So one, I don't believe in crystal balls. I do believe in big and small data, though. And I do believe in the human side of the business. And so what I'd say in the next 2 to 3 years, I think it's a very significant opportunity for Indian leaders who are top talent. I think at the same time, that's going to create a supply of very talented people that are going to be picked up all over the world, because the eyes of the world are turning to India, and your eyes have always been here. And so many people are going to be coming after the best talent in the world, and many of those people will be right here. And so I think the exciting thing for companies is it's time to become very smart, and maybe a metric that we're talking about is how many of your top talent, your really top talent, your really ready now people, are you able to retain and grow in your business?
yeah, so if in terms of development per se, I think it'll be a time of experimentation, because there's a lot of stuff coming in now. People are going to try out a lot of things, and probably at the end of 5 years, you see a shake-off, where there'll be a few things that people will kind of hold on to. The rest of, I think, all of what you said is right. But I think it's a time of experimentation.
Thank you.
And if I may add there, currently I feel talent development is also still trying to come out of remaining prescriptive. I'm hoping to see it to become more aspirational.
Amy?
Yeah, I like the word experimentation. And 5 years hence, I mean, you see, earlier in the conversation, we used the word mindset. And having a shared mindset becomes very important. And developing that mindset becomes a challenge with time. So therefore, if you have to make a shift, we have to shift to hire people with the right mindset and equip them with the competencies to kind of, perform on the job. And with that shared mindset, I think, organizations can really, as Dr. Bob Hogan said, you compete with others rather than internal. Else it becomes a challenge. Because we are having people who quit or who are promoted because of effectiveness, and then we have to make changes mid-course. And nobody is actually understanding or put a cost of such decisions. We know it, intellectually, but we don't put a cost. And that would become the decider between competitiveness and otherwise.
So there is this fascinating book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which is really about Microsoft versus open source. And it's an amazing story of how Linus actually developed Linux with a group of people working in their free time, out of passion, and then this whole open source movement. And I think that's a great model for how work is going to be done. For example, we've bought a platform which is the world's largest crowdsourced technical platform in the world. And we are now talking of hybrid crowds, which is full-time employees who are also working in this crowd model. And hence, leadership and talent required in that is going to be very different. So that's it.
Ryan, how do you answer that question in 1 minute or less?
Well, I've got to give time to the audience first. In all honesty, I see it being a lot more focused on the individual learning needs versus large whole-scale programs. I think those programs continue to exist, but the goals and objectives are going to be more focused on the individual needs instead of trying to treat everyone in one size fits all. With that, would love to open up the floor in the last few minutes we have. And just so you know, we're looking at a countdown clock. I'm wondering who's going to come defuse it. But please, if we've got some people out in the audience, I'm sure we can run a mic out to you.
Pradnya's hand is swinging and waving.
We see Pradnya waving, but I'm sure there's someone else. I'm just kidding, Pradnya. Go right ahead.
We were talking about emergence and effectiveness, and I do have to say the Hogan High Potential Report will actually give you assessment of who's emergent, who's effective. You know, if you've looked at that model, we've got leadership foundations, leadership emergence, leadership effectiveness. So that's for any one of you who wants to get a more data-based view on emergent versus effective leaders. That's one solution that's there. Just thought I'll mention that. My question to you, Fardun, has always fascinated me because I look at you as leadership development across India. And then I take it to a meta level, whereas McKinsey leadership, you're looking at leadership development globally. My question is there anything different between what's needed for developing leaders here? Like, I mean, how globally similar or different are we?
So I'll just answer it I'll answer it in one sentence and then elaborate, right? Which is people and human beings everywhere are pretty much the same. And I'll illustrate it with a few stories. So I remember a few years ago when we were starting to do some of this work in China. And this was some very deep personal work, right? Where you go into your life stories and so on and so forth. People said there's no way that people in Chinese state-owned enterprises, like hardcore kind of guys, are going to ever want to do this. And that was not true. They loved it, right? People say often that, you know, in India or in Asia, people don't speak up too much. So it's a big development need. Speaking up, right? Speaking up and saying your voice. Guess what? It's also the biggest development in the United States of speaking up. It's not that people there are that different. So yes, I'm sure there are certainly cultural differences. I mean, I worked, for example, on a merger of an Indonesian and a Japanese bank. Sure, there are lots of national differences, ranging from what shoes people wear to being punctual and coming to work. But at the core of it, when you dive down deeper, I think the essence of humanity is so common that when it actually comes to kind of working with people on an individual one-on-one basis, it's not that different. I mean, even the way you do it, by the way, need not necessarily be that different. Maybe there'll be some differences, of course, but it's not as different as people think that it would be. Because you'll have the same conversation, right? So-and-so doesn't get along with so-and-so in an organization. He finds it hard to lead his team. This person can't delegate well enough. You know, he's a CEO, but he can't really have the courage to call out someone on his team. Those are is there everywhere.
Absolutely. We had another question up here in the front. The mic's coming from the right-hand side.
Hi, my name is Vijay. This question, anyone can answer the question. So this is about owning your development journey. You know, somebody spoke about it, right? Often I've seen that organizations are good in terms of identifying the talent and then obviously putting in a plan for development for those people, right? And why using various methods and tools, right? But what typically I've seen across many organizations is that the problem really happens is the person whose plan is it, he doesn't kind of really, he falls flat, right? Through as he's running through the business or in his own professional journey, right? It falls flat. How can you share, few things that have worked for you in your organizations that has helped you to ensure one, that plan is successful and you're able to imbibe this whole ownership mindset among the people who this plan is for?
I think that's a great point, and we're all excited about when people are on the rails, and then when they go off the rails or derail, we go, oh, they derailed. But I think making sure that you have a plan for rerailment, and that is actually a tool in a railroad. They have re-railers that get the trains back on the tracks, and I think one of those things that can either help prevent or help someone stay on or get someone back on is coaching. And I would say different kinds of coaching. Of course, you always hope that the boss is going to be a good coach, but most of the times they're not. But we know that there can be good peer coaches. And then most importantly, we're big fans of third-party coaches. It gives people the opportunity to have a place to go, a place to talk, as long as the coaches aren't off the rails and they understand the business needs of the organization. We find that very helpful in that process.
So I think the one thing that so some people will naturally take ownership and keep doing stuff, and then maybe 15-20% of people will always do that, and that's great. I think one of the things that I saw, this question is, one of the CEOs I worked with in Vietnam actually, when he did the journey, he said that, one of the things he said is that, and now I do it everywhere, is that making sure that people understand that the development that they're going through is obligatory and not optional. It's a little bit like because how do we all deal with training, myself included? Like McKinsey will fly us to Harvard or something, we'll all hang out there, go for something, have a coffee, it's kind of chilled out. How do you make it kind of obligatory and not optional? So it's a little bit like, it's not a buffet that you can kind of come and, oh, I found your thought really interesting, I found your thought. It's a fixed cost menu and you have to eat everything. And one of the ways to make that happen is to really have very harsh awareness to the individual, or provide harsh awareness to the individual as to the limits of their own game. So if you tell me that, look, you're not going to grow any further in the organization if you're not going to be able to fix this, and you make it as blunt and as clear in a nice way, of course, then my incentive to actually take that learning seriously is much more than if you give me some wishy-washy feedback. So that's...
I take a different view totally. And I've noticed from my own career and seeing several transitions. And if we just go back to a simple metaphor in life, example in life, if there's a father and a son, and the father passes away and has a house, he gets the house, right? Two things happen there. He gets the title and the asset, okay? So that's the law of succession. And in organizations, it's a matter of culture. People get the title but not the asset. If you're chosen to be the next CXO or CEO, you get the title, but you don't get the asset. And who holds the asset? Not one person, could be the outgoing CEO, could be the board, could be several such people. And they, may not have the will or the skill to do that. So some of us in leadership, can we facilitate that whole process so that the asset also passes? The asset is information and insights. And I find that doesn't happen. And I've tried to make it happen in certain contexts. And there is a certain degree of success. But actually, if you see and take a step back and go from the individual to the context and the culture, then I think you have some possibilities.
And I guess the fact that it has to be made obligatory and not optional is also about knowing what motivates a person. A lot of ownership comes from that person's motivation in changing from what it is to what it can become.
We have time for 2 quick questions. We've got a couple hands, so.
I think a couple of you spoke about the conversation moving from skill set change to mindset change in the context of the kind of leadership challenges we face. From a leadership development perspective, what are the key levers you found being effective in driving mindset change in leaders?
So, like one of the panelists mentioned, more and more emphasis on managing self and self-awareness as part of development, we found definitely contributes to a mindset change better. So that's a very key.
So if I add on that, I mean, the way we think about it is that in order to change the mindsets of a group of people, there has to be something that we call the inside-out approach, which is what you said, which is deep personal work and so on and so forth. But equally, there has to be some ecosystem work, and which is the outside-in approach. And that's really around four elements, which is I will change my behaviors or my mindset if four things happen. Number one, I see others role model. So when you show me what the right thing is, when I see my boss, when other people do something in a new way, I will tend to do that. Number two is you need to build conviction, which is you need to tell me why is this change important, what exactly do you want me to do, and how will I benefit, right? The third is there has to be some reinforcing systems. So whether it's the reward systems or processes that make it easy to do that. And finally, the skills. I might not know how to do it. So I think those four kind of are needed in the ecosystem to make it happen. Otherwise, it's very hard to make mindset change happen.
Great. And one last question.
So my question is for Faridun. It's picking up on what Pradnya mentioned earlier. So when we talked about differences in behavior across cultures, and you said that it really isn't so different, would you say that the work that, say, Hofstede or Trompenas would have done, where they talk about these cultural dimensions, say collective versus individualistic cultures, would that not be relevant in today's very mobile kind of population you have, where people are very impacted because of them moving from different countries to countries? So would you say that's not relevant any longer?
No, I'm not saying that. I think it is extremely relevant. So I don't think that, I'm not saying that there are no cultural differences. There are big cultural differences. All I'm saying is the question was really when you think about development, right, you need a different approach for A versus B, right? So the cultural differences are huge. I mean, and you can imagine, right, when I was doing this work, I remember interviewing this senior Japanese banker, and he says these Indonesians come at 10 past 8 for an 8 o'clock meeting, and they say there's traffic. Why can't they just leave earlier? And it was a big thing. So there are cultural differences. It's a question of how you make people learn and how you develop people. I don't think that's very different. But yes, for people to work together and to connect with each other, many of those things are important to be aware of.
Okay, thanks.
Just endorse what Faridun says, having worked with people of different geographies. I think, well, there are geographically cultural differences, but in terms of development issues, I think we are almost same. And the same kind of issues are there in terms of people being obstinate or people not teaming up or being very hard, those are there.
On the lighter side, I was running a workshop in Germany, and so at the beginning of the workshop, I told them, look, this agenda is quite flexible, and we'll see how it goes. And that itself led to such a big problem as to how can you have an agenda that keeps changing, right? So it was like something they couldn't understand. So,
Well, I think Ambika must have German ancestry because, she's probably waving at us, telling to get us off the stage. With that, though, really appreciate your participation. Thank you, panelists, for your preparation beforehand. And